I'm locked out of the house. Welcome to $5 Gaming. I know I've mentioned this before, but if you go to a convention and you see games priced at $5 or less, it's usually not a good sign. Especially if you're in Canada, because $5 there is closer to $3.75 US. I can't get into the people who made Killing Zone without talking about UPL Company Limited. You know, the makers of the Ninja Kid games and a bunch of shoot-em-ups you've probably never heard of. Well, despite doing alright with arcade games, they were late to get in on home consoles and went bankrupt in 1992. That didn't stop one of its game designers, Tsutomu Fujisawa, from forming a new company with other former UPL employees called Scarab. They first put out a couple of arcade games, including the laughably bad Survival Arts, but their first console game? Battle Monsters on the Saturn. It went over so well that critics referred to it as a, quote, Way of the Warrior ripoff. And it's gonna take you how long to get here? Alright, I'll hang out by the garage and I'll call you back. You've screwed up on too many levels to count if your game is making, of all things, Way of the Warrior look good. At least it was an ambitious fighting game. It has some nice looking levels, some of which have several platforms you can jump on, a super move system, destructible environment pieces, and a few decent characters like a headless man, a wraith, a wizard, and clown twins? Also, I'm a sucker for games that use stop motion or captures of live actors for the fighters. It has that cheesy charm to it, particularly when the actor's combat training consists of watching a Bruce Lee movie once a few years ago. It even has something resembling a backstory. It takes place in the Dark Domain, where a bunch of creatures gather to fight over who will rule the kingdom. And that's it. Okay, it's not much, but it is relevant to this video because you see, Killing Zone is a sequel of sorts to Battle Monsters. Now let's just ignore it's a sequel on a completely different platform, and that it doesn't mention Battle Monsters at all, and that it came out less than a year after Battle Monsters, and that it's made by a company full of employees used to making shoot-em-ups that is now dead set on making fighting games. Instead, let's focus on how much of a sensational 3D fighter it is. Look, it even says so right on the cover. And yes, I do keep all my PS1 games in the trunk of my car. You don't? Far be it from me to say this isn't sensational, or 3D, or a fighter, but to put this into perspective, here's what Killing Zone looks like. This game came out 3 days before Tekken 2, which used motion capture for its character models, and it shows. Killing Zone, not so much, and it shows. All I'm gonna say is, let's make the claim on the box art a little more grounded. That's better. Anyway, the game had two publishers, Naxat Soft for Japan, and for everyone else. Holy shit, Acclaim, what didn't you publish in the 90s? Presentation in fighting games is one of those things you can overlook easily until a glaring lack of it is staring you in the face. Case in point, here's how Killing Zone starts up. No intro, no music. And here's what its options menu looks like, complete with "I just powered on the arcade board" text. It wouldn't surprise me at all if it turned out this game wasn't finished when it went to print. Even though this is a follow-up of sorts to Battle Monsters, which had its own backstory and something resembling individual stories for each character, Killing Zone seems to hit the reset button on everything. And I say seems to because I've read the backstory on this game a couple dozen times and I'm still confused. The world is ruled by darkness, which brings every fantastical species together to fight in a tournament of death. The winning species will rule the world of light. which I don't know if that's this world or another world, for 1,000 years. And every species can have only one representative. Then it talks about the last 7 fighters resting before the final elimination round, which I guess there were others before this, and how their species will go extinct if they don't win, which wasn't part of the deal, but I guess it is not. Wait a minute, there's a mummy, a reanimated corpse, and a skeleton in this game. Aren't those all technically the same species? And if this tournament before the tournament had every species in it, does that mean we missed out on fights like unicorn versus kraken? Or vampire versus duckweed? As for the characters themselves, no one has a backstory. Another thing Battle Monsters did that this game doesn't. Unless you count the flavor text in the instruction booklet. This is a mythological creature. Fascinating. Anyway, the transition from making a 2D fighter to a 3D fighter was rough, to say the least. They're all monsters of some kind, and a couple are at least unique in design, if I'm being generous. Like how the Dark Fairy has a familiar following her, or the Gorgon has a snake's body below the waist. However, the way they're rendered often includes vague, ugly blotches of polygons that flicker in and out of existence, or in the Gorgon's case, a body that between the waist and the tail breaks into segments like a stack of sausage links. This is complemented by backgrounds with what even at the time were ugly, blurry, blocky textures, some of which don't even line up properly. Of course, that doesn't include the ones that are just missing entirely. Basically, Killing Zone looks like what a graphics whore who didn't grow up with a PS1 thinks all PS1 games look like. The rest are pretty generic in presentation, like the Minotaur, or the Skeleton, or Frankenstein's monster. Ah, great, we set off the copyright infringement alarms. Not to worry though, Killing Zone worked around this. His species is called Giant, which is actually a step down from Battle Monsters where he was called Death Mask, and he had that iconic battle cry. As janky as some of the combat animations look, particularly for the bigger characters, the victory animations can be every bit as awkward. The only ones that came out decent are the giants and the fairies, though hers is just standing still and laughing like an anime villain. My personal favorite is the mummies. He apparently has Dalzim's stretchy limbs, but with the wrappings, his arms just look like those paper yo-yos you would find in the 100 ticket bin at Chuck E. Cheese. Want to hear something bizarre about these characters? They don't have proper names. The name you see depends on whether they're the first or second fighter in the match. Yes, each character has 2 names. For example, the mummy is Rem as player 1 or Majetti as player 2. The skeleton can be Cal or Hal. The werewolf is Gush or Toma? Either the translation butchered some of the names or Scarab really likes mid-70s crime dramas. Anyway, the looks aren't the only step down from the prior game. While Battle Monsters has 12 characters to choose from, Killing Zone only has 7. Not only that, there's somehow a creative step back from Battle Monsters. It's like someone flipped through a Dungeons & Dragons campaign right after watching Big Bad Beetleborgs, and this roster was the result. Minotaur, Mummy, Skeleton who doesn't resemble Spinal from Killer Instinct at all because he doesn't have a headband. Each character has speed, skill, and power ratings from A to C. These show up in the demo screen at the main menu, but aren't listed anywhere in the instruction booklet. Maybe that's because they largely don't mean much. Power sort of works the way it's supposed to, but skill is an ambiguous stat with no explanation and no easily discernible meaning. Speed might pertain to the speed of the attacks, because it sure as hell doesn't have anything to do with movement speed, which is similar or the same across every fighter. Regardless of who you choose, you'll have to contend with the controls almost as much as the other fighters. Light and heavy punch and kick, or as they're phrased in this game, jab and power punch and kick, block and sidestep. Nothing feels smooth in this game. from special attacks to basic movement. Everyone has a running and walking speed, but the only one that feels decent is when double tapping back to move away quickly. Walking is way too slow, and running is usually too fast. Special attacks usually don't have complex inputs, down and forward plus square plus X for example, but the game would eat inputs on a regular basis for moves that required more than 2 different directional inputs or more than 2 face buttons, which is a little under half of the moves in the game. 3D movement consists of a sidestep, which also moves the fighter a step closer. If you're trying to be aggressive, that's fine, but when you're just trying to get out of the way while maintaining distance, it doesn't work as well. The camera doesn't like it either, as it takes a long time to readjust whenever someone sidesteps. Then again, the camera struggles with pretty much everything. It constantly hard cuts to different angles, including abrupt zoom-ins on certain attacks, and it can't even focus on the winner properly after each round. 3D movement's also useless against characters with a decent amount of horizontal attacks, of which there are 2? This speaks to a larger problem with Killing Zone. It throws in certain mechanics, but doesn't seem to balance them at all. Characters with weapons, like the Minotaur and the Skeleton, have a much longer reach than everyone else. The one exception is the Gorgon, which can use its tail as a weapon to strike from distance. However, the cooldowns on these moves are pretty quick, so other characters have little recourse if these attacks get used over and over. Then there's the Werewolf. While in wolf form, he gets a 25% damage bonus to his attacks, but to activate that, you have to run for 3 seconds. Which is actually more like 1 full second, but whatever. Or you can hit one specific uppercut special move to change instantly. First off, between the uppercut and backing up all the way to run forward and maybe have the transformation work, which one would you choose? Second, considering his low damage output to begin with, 25% extra damage doesn't actually help much. Third, he can't get knocked out of this form, only get rid of it himself by blocking or the fight lasting way too long. So why would you ever leave this form? And finally, the Werewolf is the only character with an ability like this. Considering he's already not that strong as a wolf, why even bother with the human form? Also, he has the same human voice whether he's in human or wolf form. And the same wolf howl in human and wolf form. All I'm gonna say is, Bloody Roar got it right. And that is my obligatory Bloody Roar reference for this video. As for how the rest of the game sounds, it reminds me of the kind of stuff I would throw together in those MIDI music creators in the early 2000s. The most common instruments include orchestral hits, pipe organs, and loud repetitive drum tracks. Some also come with inappropriate techno-like bleeps and sweeps. Obnoxious, a bit repetitive, not mixed well at times, and only has 1, maybe 2 decent tracks. Passable at its best, outright annoying at its worst. Killing Zone's OST is a Saint Anger out of 10. Most characters have unique voices, though the one voice you'll remember from Killing Zone is the announcer before each round.
Reach you up!
I'm sorry, what?
Reach you up!
I'm just gonna leave some suggestions on screen, and you decide what he's saying. Kind of like Mortal Kombat, this guy also likes to say what I assume is excellent for when big attacks hit.
Excellent!
Of course, by big attack, I mean throw. That was just a throw. It doesn't do that for any special moves. Then again, this game's idea of a special move is rather loose. Most of them don't have difficult button inputs and don't look all that different from most basic attacks. If you're looking to pull off long combos, you are playing the wrong game. Killing Zone doesn't allow for more than 4, sometimes 5 consecutive attacks in predetermined lines noted in the instruction booklet. And I know this is going to sound strange, but the instruction booklet is far and away the best part of Killing Zone. It's not that it's particularly informative or well written, in fact it's quite the opposite. Each character possesses unique death blows which are perfected by combining directional button and other buttons. That's just a sample of what the booklet has to offer. And no, there aren't any fatalities. Death blow just means attack. The real stars of the show are the move lists. Want to know how to do the stun gun besides? Or the demerit graviton for the werewolf? How about the Gorgon's move list? The only move list where they typed out both the Japanese and English move names. Gusty metacarpus indeed. My absolute favorite though is the Mummy's move list. Just look at these move names. It reads less like an attack list and more like someone typed out subtitles for a beatboxer. Well, except for this one.
Da da da. Da da da.
And at some point it just starts referencing Saturday Night Live characters before making up a few Dr. Wily robot masters. You can't tell me with a straight face that you wouldn't want to fight Blow-Up Big Man in the next Mega Man game. Did I mention that in Battle Monsters, only certain stages had ring-outs? Like this one where you fall into a carnivorous plant? In Killing Zone, none of the stages have borders. Some are in the air, so fighters will simply fall off screen, but sometimes these stages forget the ground isn't supposed to be there, and a ringed out fighter will land on nothing. For whatever reason, the decision was made to have a floor a few feet below some stages. Hey, they even thought to add water below one stage. Which is actually just the ground with a moving texture over it. It behaves just like the featureless gradients a few feet below other stages. Aside from looking terrible, there's no safeguard for the player or CPU if they get too close to the edge. I accidentally fell off several times, but a lot of those were from me baiting the CPU into position for a ring out. There's a lunging attack everyone can do to a downed opponent, and it just so happens that this usually puts the CPU near the edge. That or just jumping over them and pushing them over, or sidestepping and landing a couple attacks to knock them over are all viable strategies because damn near every move knocks your opponent down. These were viable strategies for every single difficulty setting available, including the hardest difficulty, which is actually just called hardest. That all assumes the AI is stupid enough for this to work. Okay, you've seen the footage, so obviously, yes it is, but sometimes it's actually so dumb that even these aren't viable strategies. I've seen some bad fighting game AI in my day. I mean, I did play Duel Heroes after all, but Killing Zone did something I've never seen before. You'd think when constructing the opposing AI in a fighting game, you would make sure to include two things: moving toward the other fighter, and attacking. The AI in this game struggles to do both at the same time. I won several rounds by landing a couple shots, moving to the other side of the arena, and letting the clock run out. The whole time, the opponent would throw attacks like I was standing directly in front of them. If I had to guess, I think this was a known problem which was patched over haphazardly. I say that because certain attacks cause these fighters to take a step forward. There were some fights where I'd back up, they'd inch their way toward me with a series of attacks, and I'd have to back out again. Not like it matters much in the long run, or in Killing Zone's case, the incredibly short run. There are only two modes of play, the first being normal mode. Was the name arcade mode trademarked at the time or something? Pick a character and win 7 fights, the last of which is a mirror match, all of which are clearly shown on this hastily drawn map. If you were expecting some kind of final boss type character, you were expecting way too much out of this game. Like how no characters have any backstory, there's no ending for when you finish normal mode. All you get are brief statistical breakdowns of each fight, and some after-imaging of how the last round ended, with the only music being played by a typewriter. The one other mode of play is different. In auto mode, you pick a fighter, pick a preset for various stats like strength, intelligence, speed, etc., and direct it through a series of fights by telling it when to do things like attack, block, do special attacks, and so on. It's like playing the fighting game equivalent of those football manager games. Your character's stats build up with every fight, complete with numbers that may or may not add up properly, and eventually your character's appearance starts to change a bit. A bit of a weird way to show their growth over the course of each series of fights. Your inputs improve as well. See, at the start of this mode you only have two commands, attack and advance. Attack is exactly what you would expect, but advance isn't. It's a lunging attack against a downed opponent. In other words, you start auto mode without the ability to say, hey dipshit, move forward. And you end it that way too. Sure, you learn another dozen or so commands like probe, specials, and fast moves, but even late in the game, there were moments where both fighters would flail at the air 20 feet apart, and I'd get frustrated that I couldn't move closer. The saving grace for me was the specials button. Less than halfway through auto mode, I started just holding the specials button the entire fight. The same thing would happen almost every time. Attack spamming leading to a ring out. The times it didn't work, I won by knockout. And that's in spite of this awkward camera angle every fight in auto mode uses, which makes it harder than necessary to judge distance between the two fighters. I can almost appreciate things like the growth of the character's stats and change in appearance. Even the non-ending seems better than what normal mode had, if for no other reason than someone remembered to play music over it. Okay, maybe the music isn't an improvement, but I do have two problems with this. The first is the lack of control I mentioned earlier, both with movement and the commands unlocking way too slow and in a bizarre order. The second is that auto mode is specifically designed to be a giant waste of time. It starts with the Fiendish Tournament, which is single elimination with 16 fighters. Once you win that, you advance to the Nightmare Tournament, which is a series of round-robin fights between 8 fighters. Get the highest score in that, and you advance to the Evil Tournament, which is single elimination with 16 fighters. Then you get to do the Evil Tournament again. Then you get to do the Evil Tournament again. Then you get to do the Evil Tournament again. Nope, the vocal track isn't skipping. You play through the Evil Tournament 4 times. And every time you finish, you get a set amount of points based on how well you did. You have to have the most points after all 4 of those tournaments in order to advance. Then finally, you advance to the Bloodbath Tournament, yet another single elimination set with 16 fighters. Win that, and you put auto mode out of its misery. I'll give normal mode this much. It was short. My first playthrough lasted under 20 minutes. Auto mode took me 45 minutes to get through. The absurd amount of tournaments on top of tournaments on top of tournaments is bad enough, as is the repetitive structure. But if you lose at any point in the elimination brackets, you start that tournament over. If you come up a point or two short in the Nightmare Tournament, you have to do the entire round-robin set over. If you come up a point short in the Evil Tournaments, you have to do all 4 Evil Tournaments again. Sure, you keep your stat growth, but having to replay one fight in normal mode versus replaying an entire series of fights in auto mode? If these weren't single round battles, it would have taken over an hour for me to get through this mess one time. And really, that's all I can say about Killing Zone as a whole. It's a mess. If you squint really hard, you can see the framework of a decent fighting game. The problem is, nothing, not one part of Killing Zone, feels like a finished product. The combat, the arenas, the fighters, the music, the debug mode text in various menus, even the name of the game sounds like a placeholder. Give it another 5 or 6 months of development and who knows, maybe it could be... okay, I won't say it would be good, but... average? Passable? Obviously, this isn't worth the $375 price tag, and it's high on the list of the worst fighting games I've ever played. Definitely worse than the likes of War Gods and Duel Heroes. But it's not quite the worst. Pray that you never have to see me cover what's at the top of that list. But what about the developers? In the same year, Scarab developed a couple of Sega Saturn titles, and by titles I mean GameWare, a glorified magazine in disc form, and Angel Paradise, a series of minigames and FMVs for only the loneliest of men. Sadly, company head Stomo Fujisawa died in 1998. His wife would take charge of the company until Kavia, later known as AQ Interactive, bought them out and Scarab became Feel Plus Inc. Eventually, they would get absorbed into AQ Interactive, which merged with Marvelous Entertainment to become Marvelous AQL, which then just became Marvelous Inc. Somewhere in the midst of all this, Acclaim went out of business, and the limited distribution rights to several games they published were snapped up by various groups. Last year, Liquid Media Group made the equivalent of a yard sale purchase from Throwback Entertainment, gaining the rights they held to 65 former Acclaim games, including Killing Zone. I'll just assume this got lumped in with a bunch of NBA Jam and Bust-A-Move titles, and Liquid Media didn't notice it was there. But, for those of you who have been clamoring for that Killing Zone remaster, now you know who to direct all of your Change.org petitions to. What the fuck is an end slate?